In the 1970s, a hidden war was taking shape, not in the jungles of Vietnam or the deserts of the Middle East, but along the border between Mexico and the United States. Fueled by rising drug demand in the U.S. and corruption in Mexico, a new power began to rise: the Mexican drug cartels. Part 1: Origins of Trafficking Visuals, Rural Mexican Landscapes, Opium Poppy and Marijuana Fields, Early Traffickers. Drug trafficking in Mexico didn't begin with the cartels. As early as the 1940s, Mexican farmers were cultivating marijuana and opium poppies, supplying drugs to both domestic and U.S. markets. By the 1970s, these small-scale operations had become more organized. One name stands out from this era: Pedro Aviles Perez. Known as one of the first major Mexican drug lords, Aviles was a pioneer of the so-called Mexican Connection. He moved marijuana and heroin into the United States using small aircraft, forging early smuggling routes that would later be used by larger criminal organizations. Part 2: The War on Drugs begins. Visuals: Nixon, DEA formation, Operation Intercept, border delays. In 1969, U.S. President Richard Nixon launched Operation Intercept, a bold, if short-lived effort to stop drugs from flowing into the country. Border agents inspected nearly every vehicle crossing from Mexico, causing economic chaos. The operation failed to significantly reduce drug imports, but it did set the tone for decades of U.S. drug policy: aggressive, reactionary, and focused on supply rather than demand. It also marked the rise of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, which would soon play a critical role in cross-border narcotics enforcement. Part 3: The Guadalajara Cartel Rises. Visuals, 1970s. Guadalajara, old photos of cartel founders. As U.S. demand for narcotics soared, so did the opportunity for profit. After Pedro Aviles was killed in a shootout with police in 1978, his former lieutenants rose to power. The most important were Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Rafael Caro Quintero. Together, they founded the Guadalajara Cartel, the first true Mexican drug cartel, headquartered in the heart of Jalisco. With a centralized structure and access to both marijuana fields and trafficking routes, they became a dominant force. The cartel quickly struck deals with Colombia's Medellin cartel, becoming the key middleman for smuggling cocaine into the United States. Part 4: Corruption and Control. Visuals: Mexican police and politicians, hidden drug labs, bribery exchanges, dramatized. To maintain power, the Guadalajara cartel relied heavily on corruption. Police, military officials, and politicians were paid to look the other way, or directly aid in operations. In many parts of Mexico, the line between government and cartel became nearly invisible. The cartel didn't just control drug trafficking, it controlled territory, law enforcement, and information. Part 5: DEA involvement increases. Visuals: DEA agents working in Mexico, maps of drug routes, DEA reports. Meanwhile, in the United States, the DEA was intensifying its fight against cartels. Agents were embedded in Mexico, gathering intelligence and working with, and sometimes against, Mexican authorities. One of those agents was Enrique Kiki Camarena, whose story would soon become a turning point in the drug war. But in the late 1970s, the DEA was still learning just how deep the cartel's roots ran. Despite arrests and busts, the Guadalajara cartel's empire continued to grow, trafficking billions of dollars worth of drugs into the U.S. Part 6: The 1980s. The cartel era begins. Visuals: cocaine seizures, cartel mansions, maps of routes into the U.S. By the early 1980s, the Guadalajara cartel had become a powerhouse. It moved cocaine for Colombia, grew marijuana across Mexico, and began exploring heroin production at scale. This era marked the beginning of the cartel age, when Mexican drug organizations moved from scattered traffickers to transnational criminal empires. Each year, the U.S. drug market grew larger, And every shipment, every bribe, every assassination solidified the cartel's grip on Mexico. Visuals: slow zoom on the border fence, faded photos of cartel leaders. The drug war between Mexico and the United States didn't begin with El Chapo or the modern-day Sinaloa cartel. It began here, in the fields of Sinaloa, the streets of Guadalajara, and the corridors of power on both sides of the border. This is just the beginning. The story of the 1980s and beyond is far darker. End screen. Subscribe for part 2, The Camarena Case and the Fall of Guadalajara,